Hey guys, and welcome back to Grade 1 of the Carrot Poker School. This is Lecture 2, and today's topic is value betting. Value betting is one of the primary purposes for betting, along with bluffing, which we're going to talk about in the following lecture. We'll also talk a bit about denial today, which is my word for protection. I'll get into why I use a different word to the masses soon enough. But denial is going to be the reason for betting that's more secondary. It's never really enough on its own, but we are going to still stress today when it can help and when it can push us over the fence of value betting compared with not value betting. But on to value betting, the primary topic of today's lecture. This is a really important skill. It's one of those things that if you can value bet correctly, if you can understand when it's a situation that's not allowed for you to value bet in, optional for you to value bet in, or perhaps even mandatory, where you must value bet, your game will be in really good shape. These really are the key situations with respect to value betting in poker. Sometimes people make big errors by value betting in situations where it's not allowed, or even missing mandatory value bets even more commonly. In optional value bet spots, you can't really make a big blunder by value betting or not value betting, at least theoretically. There could be an exploitative reason for which you have to do this, but exploitatively speaking, that's a different ballgame altogether. So when it comes to optional value betting, while you can't blunder immediately by making a huge error that costs tons of chips, what you can do is build a range that's absurd. So if you bet for value every time you're in a spot that's only optional to value bet, where solvers and GTO is going to mix value betting with checking, you're going to build a really strong betting range that's got too many value combinations in it, and you're going to build too weak of a checking range that's very easily exploited by opposition bets. One of the most fundamental leaks in the game of micro and low stakes players, in my opinion, and this comes from over a decade of teaching people privately, is the inability to protect a checking range, to have a checking range that's just so weak that the fold equity following that check is through the roof. There are spots when you're meant to have a weak checking range. You're not always meant to be uncapped in every single situation, but when you bet every optional value bet, you end up playing just like the population does, just like the masses, and you build a very predictably weak checking range. That's one of the things we're going to try and fix today by understanding when it's just optional to value bet. To decipher this puzzle, to find out when is it mandatory, when is it optional, and when is it actually prohibited that you can value bet, there are two key factors that determine which of these three worlds you're in. Firstly, urgency. This is an extremely fundamental Carrot Poker School concept. It's one of these concepts that's going to pop up in Grade 1, then with a few more layers of complexity in Grade 2, and then in a slightly more advanced way again in Grade 3. And urgency is, as this little picture of the stopwatch indicates, it's how much time is left for you to value bet. More on that in a minute. Landing equity is more about the strength of your hand when you start off on that street. When we say landing, we mean the equity you get to that bet opportunity spot with. We don't mean your equity after you bet and villain continues. That's something else. So let's examine each of these right now, because these are the core fundamental puzzle pieces for figuring out when it's a can value bet spot, when it's cannot value bet, and when it's must value bet. If you can get this right, you'll avoid so many mistakes that your peers are going to make and your opponents are going to make. So urgency, first of all. Urgency refers to how important it is to value bet now, right now, rather than waiting until later. It's dependent on the amount of time remaining in a hand, and you can read time as decision points, how many more nodes. We might say the word nodes, which means individual opportunities for each player. So if you think about ignoring raising for now, you just imagine like two people in a pot together, there are 6 general bet opportunity nodes there. Each player has 2 bet opportunity nodes on each street. So a node is almost like half a street. And when the amount of time remaining in the hand compared with the investment ceiling for your hand is high, then urgency will be lower because there's loads of time in which to reach that investment ceiling. When the amount of time left is lower compared with a very high investment ceiling, then urgency will be higher. You've got to reach that ceiling quicker. Imagine you're climbing up a ladder and you've got 50 rungs to climb up to traverse upwards, and you've only got 5 minutes to do it. Well, you better get climbing. If you need to climb up a very small ladder in 1 hour, you can take your time. You can chill and read a book on one of the lower rungs. So this is all about how quickly you've got to reach your destination. And that's not just based on how much time is left, it's also based on how far away your destination is. It almost takes me back to like doing physics in high school and distance, time, and speed, right? Equations of that nature. So weaker value betting hands can often delay their betting until later on in the hand, because they don't need to invest so much by the end. They don't have this high investment ceiling, so there's very few rungs for them to climb up. They can do that quite easily. On the other hand, our stronger value betting candidate hands will want to invest more money by the end of the hand, and thus they usually end up making larger investments a bit sooner. You might wonder, why do solvers bet bigger on flops like 9-5-3 compared with flops like Ace, Queen, 7? Well, the idea is on 9-5-3 you have so many unique overpairs that your opponent doesn't have, that are abundant combinatorically speaking, and want to push the pot size up to that very high investment ceiling, that the solver likes to do it faster, likes to start climbing at a quicker rate sooner into the journey. So when it comes to mandatory value bets, they're typically hands that have higher investment ceilings and less time left to reach them. It's okay to bet small on 9-5-3 as well, but you better be overbetting certain turn cards later in that case. Very strong hands, unless you're getting raised a lot, do have to do a lot of pot building, and that pot building has to come from you, especially where you think your human opponents are not raising as much as a solver would, for example. So it's very important not to dilly-dally or delay value betting, not to undersize value bets in spots where your opponents aren't raising enough especially. Because the less your opponent's raising, the higher your urgency is, the more of the burden falls on your shoulders to build the pot yourself. So at shorter stack depths, urgency is lower. 3-bet pots, 4-bet pots, you might wonder, well, why does solver bet like 25% in a 4-bet pot? What's that all about? It's got a really big nut advantage here. Why is it doing that? It's got so many nutted hands that want to build the pot. Well, the idea is that although your range might be very strong, the pot's already grown a lot of the way towards its investment ceiling. And so in order to get the rest in, you don't really have to do a lot of betting. People talk a lot about geometric betting. Oh, you've got to grow the pot geometrically. You really don't. It doesn't actually matter whether you grow the pot in a geometric smooth way or in more of a sort of up and down jagged way, as long as you reach the investment ceiling by the end for your hand one way or another. Could be by villain betting and you raising, could be by you betting, then it's fine. What you don't want to do is create pots that are way too small for your very good hands. So urgency and time remaining in the hand are inversely proportionate. As the time left in the hand goes down, and basically that means we're actually kind of moving backwards in time here. On the river, urgency is very high. There's not a lot of time left in the hand. And as we move backwards in time and say that there's more and more time remaining back towards the turn, the flop, back from being in position to actually being out of position, giving our opponent a betting opportunity, if we check, our urgency is going to go down because there's more time left to do it. Imagine you had to write an essay for the Carrot Poker School on this topic, and I said it was due in 1 week, and it's a 1,000 word essay. You probably don't have to write it today, right? But imagine that essay was due tomorrow. Well, there's less time remaining, urgency is higher, you better get writing. Same idea with pot building with value betting. Urgency is a key concept. So as our hand equity increases, our urgency also increases, because stronger hands will retain more equity after building a big pot, getting called, making another massive bet, getting called again. Even by filtering the opponent's range significantly through the process of large investment, these hands still remain significant equity favorites. So the higher the landing equity, the starting equity of your hand, the higher the equity will be after you bet and get called. Therefore, these hands have more urgency because they crave a bigger pot eventually. The third thing which affects this is stack depth. In single raised pots, it's much more common to see things like turn overbets than it is in 3-bet or 4-bet pots. There are other factors as well, of course, that can make overbetting or large betting more prominent, even at smaller SPRs, stack to pot ratios. But generally, there's just less urgency here because there's less work to be done. I guess it's a bit like writing a 300-word essay instead of that 1,000-word essay I told you to write earlier. Well, that one's only going to take you a third of the time, so you don't have to get started quite as quickly. Or you can do a little bit at a time, much like betting small on the flop and then small again on the turn, something that happens a lot in 3-bet pots and 4-bet pots in GTO. So urgency is really core as a principle. We'll be returning to it time and time again throughout the Carrot Poker School in future grades as well. If you've taken our full scholarship, you'll have lots more urgency related stuff coming your way in the future. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about types of equity. Your hand needs to have high landing equity before it's permissible for you to value bet. The landing equity of your hand is basically the equity your hand has before your opponent's reacted to your bet. So you could think of this as your equity when you first arrive at a betting decision. Or you could think about this as your equity just after you've bet, but before he's reacted. So this is key because the bigger the landing equity, generally, the bigger the finishing equity. While the finishing equity is lower than the landing equity because your opponent's range goes through a process of contracting and shedding its weakest combinations, the finishing equity of your hand is still likely to be quite high if your landing equity was very high. So your finishing equity is essentially how well your hand is doing. Again, it's a hypothetical value, right? Like if you were to go to showdown, it's not EV, it's not the full story. There's going to be other things at play here as well, like position or implied odds or realizability. But yeah, the higher your landing equity, the higher your finishing equity. So I start off by thinking about landing equity because it's easier to compute. Now, it's kind of difficult to assess finishing equity. Like you don't really know exactly what your equity will be, of course, after you bet and your opponent calls. You're not a solver with perfect information. You're not omniscient. There's not really any way of telling, but you can estimate it. So when you bet and your opponent calls your bet, your equity is going to go down. And the idea is that in order for your bet to qualify as mainly a value bet, and it may have other elements of other things in it, like denying equity to worse hands, but for it to be mainly a value bet, you need to be at least 50% equity after you get called. So that's to say that after you've contracted your opponent's range, not before, you need to be a 50% or greater favorite. It's a very big fallacy that if you have the best hand more often than not, that you can value bet, because clearly if you're in bad shape after a bet gets called, there's no sense in which that bet can be considered value if you're losing the pot most of the time after your opponent continues. So it really is important to differentiate landing and finishing equity. To value bet the turn, you're going to need somewhere in the realm of about 50%. The reason for that is that you can have implied odds as well that can make it the case that even though you might only win the pot around 51% of the time, which is not actually enough to value bet rivers generally, and one reason to understand that is that, well, you might get raised as well, which is even worse than being called. So if you only have about 51% equity on the river after your bet gets called, it's not worth making that bet, because while you're a slight favourite in the branch of the tree where villain calls you, remember thinking about poker as a tree of possibilities, there's also a branch where you get raised usually, and that branch is much worse for you, and very often the EV of your value hands gets reduced to 0 in these situations. Whether you call or whether you fold, it's just lose-lose, it's bad either way. On the turn though, we can be more lenient. So on the river, we need about 55 to 60% finishing equity to bet. On the turn, it's not so strict because of implied odds. So we can bet the turn with a hand that's thin value, maybe it's top pair, but because we have that 2-pair out or that trips out or something like that, we're actually able to garner more EV from winning massive pots on rarer branches, but significant ones magnitude-wise, where we just hit something really big on the river and get paid. Because those branches exist, you can generally bet something like top pair with a flush draw for value. Even if your equity when called is somewhat close to 50%, it's going to be fine because of the implied odds you get on flush completing rivers and allow you to value bet again. You're not just trying to win the pot as it stands. Equity doesn't describe all of the future bets you can earn, as we saw last time. So we get to harvest another thing as well when we bet turn, and that's denial. So it's not just about implied odds, I thought I would mention that. But another reason why we can sometimes bet turns more thinly for value than we can bet rivers is that there's this extra benefit of denying equity to weaker hands that are always going to fold, but on the turn it's actually useful for us to make those hands fold. On the river that goes away because these hands can outdraw us. They're drawing dead, right? There's no such thing as a straight draw on the river. Although I'm sure I've taught students once upon a time who told me they had a straight draw on the river. That's another story. So our landing equity then is the higher value amount that we start off with in a decision point. Then we may choose to bet, and having bet, our opponent might choose to call. This is a branch of the tree, and when this branch of the tree occurs, we then end up with a lower quantity of equity that we'll be referring to as our finishing equity. So landing and finishing equity is not the same thing. What's the effect of bet sizing on this translation between landing equity and finishing equity? Well, the idea is that the bigger you bet, the more intense the contraction will be in your opponent's range, the more bad hands he'll be shedding and throwing into the muck. So that means there'll be a bigger gap between landing equity and finishing equity, because your opponent will get rid of more bad hands, his equity will go up more. As poker, at least in heads-up pots, are a zero-sum game, that means that when his equity goes up, yours goes down. Right. So when we B33 here and get called, we don't experience a big dip between our landing equity and finishing equity. Remember that our goal is to have around 55 to 60% finishing equity on the river and around 50% on the turn. That means that the starting equity or landing equity that we need to value bet for B33 is not that high. It may only be in the 60s or low 70s. It doesn't have to be a whopping 80% hand, because the idea is you're only causing a minimal contraction in the range of your opponent. If you use a more standard bet size, probably a more popular one for things like turn C betting or river betting, B75, again, B75 means betting 75% of the pot, then the contraction in your opponent's range will be greater, your equity will plummet a bit more, and thus, in order to reach your target finishing equity, you're going to have larger landing equity to start with. Same thing goes with overbetting. The contraction is now even greater. These are not to scale, don't take them too literally. I didn't get a measuring tape out onto my monitor here. But yeah, the idea is that with B150, the contraction is rather significant, and therefore it's not uncommon to want to expect massive amounts of equity to embark on a value bet of this size. So we need to know roughly how much landing equity we'd need for each bet size in order for our hand to value bet that size. So what's the landing equity requirement? Why do we examine landing equity? What's that all about? Why is it required landing equity for bet sizes that we look at and not finishing equity? Because the latter is really hard to work out, but in a solver, you're going to be able to get really used to just scanning over starting equities of hands, putting on the equity display in your, whether it's a browser-based solver or you own your own solver which you use, it doesn't really matter. You can turn on an equity view and actually look at which hands are above the thresholds that you need to value bet for each kind of sizing. So this is what a table would look like. When we're value betting the turn, we can often do it just as a very slight favorite. Sometimes we don't even need 55%, especially out of position. We'll get to that. But when we're value betting the river, it's much more common to need more equity to get away with a certain bet size for value, because on the river, the bet size is exclusively value or a bluff. And in this case, value. We talk about bluffing next time. It's not for denial. We're not denying equity on the river because our opponent can't fold anything that's bad but live. He's just going to be folding either better hands or worse hands. Basically, it's way ahead, way behind. And secondly, there's no more implied odds to garner. There's no more EV to get from future bets on the next street. It's just the bet you're making now. Therefore, you need to be more strict on the river, as we said. For B33, we're going to go with, and I want you to focus on the river here, just because it's the more important one, which will be a bit more rigid. On the turn, you can get away with a bit more. On the flop, you can get away with almost anything, because equities run so close together between the ranges and lots of things are possible. But on the river, we've got to be more strict. So try and remember that 65 to 70% equity is a good starting target for a hand that's going to make a B33 for value. Now, you're probably sitting here thinking, Pete, how am I meant to know the equity of my hand? This is preposterous. I can't know that. You're not meant to. It's basically like, I don't know how high the wall outside my house is. I've never measured it. I could hazard a guess. I'd probably be off considerably. But I do know that I can jump onto that wall from the ground, at least currently. Maybe not when I'm old. But yeah, I can jump onto that wall, and I know that. Therefore, I can say I have enough jumping skills to jump onto that wall. I don't know how high the wall is exactly, and I don't know exactly how high I can jump, but I know that I satisfy the criteria. So very often you'll just know that your hand is good enough to satisfy the criteria for betting one of these sizes without knowing exactly what that is or without even remembering the exact threshold. This is all fine. With B75, you might wonder, well, why do we need so much equity to bet this size? Surely like 75 to 80% means we're a massive favorite. It does, but recall that after we bet, we're going to become less of a favorite, right? He's going to change his range, he's going to contract it, and we're going to have to be surviving against the new range that he calls our bet with, not the old one that we were against before we bet, or before he reacted. And with B150, it's very common on the river to actually require 85 to 90% equity to use the sizing. Again, there's no other benefits here, it's a pure value bet, so we need a lot of starting equity to have enough finishing equity when we're done. Another thing that's worth noting here is that board texture, in particular the drawiness of it, has a lot to do with what our equity band will actually be and what the requirements for certain bet sizes will be. So on wet turn spots, meaning lots of draws are possible, our hand is ahead more often than our equity actually suggests. Like, it's perfectly reasonable for me to value bet for B150 when you have a flush draw and I have a set. Totally reasonable if that was your whole range was that flush draw and my whole range was that set, I would just always bet, right? And that's fine. But I wouldn't be a massive favourite because the draw would still be live. It would have 18 to 25% equity against me depending. And yeah, I'd have to fade certain river cards to win the pot. So contrast that to a situation where we have a really dry texture, where if I have a set, I'm basically invincible. Let's say it's like King 9, 5 deuce rainbow. Okay, there's a few gutters you can have or whatever, but you're not likely to call with those. I overbet and you call and I have a set. I basically just win, right? I just always win. And so I have 100% equity. So basically when you're on a dry texture and you only have 75% equity, you're never going to be close to overbetting because that means you're actually losing close to 25% of the time. But when you're on a wet texture, you might be able to overbet with 80% equity or 78% or something. And this is because a lot of the opponent's equity doesn't come from hands that beat you, it comes from draws that have to continue. or not. Either way, it's win-win. So texture matters. Look to have more equity for certain sizing on a dry texture because you actually need to be ahead, and on the wet texture, your equity will naturally be lower, but not in a way that stops you wanting to value bet. When in position, we need a little more equity to value bet because we risk the reopening of the action, and therefore checking is a slightly more viable alternative in lots of cases. This is a really key point. When you're not closing the action for street because you're out of position, the EV of checking is never going to be that high because you're not always seeing the next street. You're not guaranteeing full realizability for one street even of your equity. If you're on the turn, you may not see the river. If you're on the flop, you may not see the turn or the river. If you're in position, you can at least guarantee visibility for the next street, right? Realizability. So the idea is that because betting opportunities are comparisons of EV between betting and checking, if the action's already open and I can't close it by checking, well, check just isn't as good as it would be if the action was being closed by my check. So if check isn't as good, then I don't need bet to be very good to pick that line on the turn or on the flop. But if checking is really good, then I might not want to risk opening the action for minimal gain. So I'd say that in general, out of position, you need a little less equity for these bet sizes, and block betting, B33ing, out of position is a very common practice in GTO because of this phenomenon. But when you're in position, is it worth betting 33 or 25% of the pot for value when you reopen the action by making that bet? Oftentimes it's not. So yeah, position matters to all kinds of things, no less equity. When out of position, we need a little less equity to value bet because check is just less viable. That's the idea. When in position, we need more because check is so viable. It's like if I offered you $200 in each case, but then in one case I offered you an alternative of 300 and in another case only 50, your answer would be different each time, right? Whether you choose that $200 because it depends what the other option actually is. This is key. So let's go back to our three different potential worlds for value betting: can value bet, cannot value bet, and must value bet. Remember, telling which one you're in is so important. So in game theory, these are the situations. Must value bet, when your hand is strong enough to pick the bet size that you're thinking of, and the urgency is high. It's high enough that you actually have to do the betting right now, in the same way that you have to start your homework assignment now because it's due tomorrow. Same idea, right? We've talked about urgency already. Perhaps it's merely optional for you to value bet. This would be the case whenever your hand is strong and strong enough to pick the bet size that you're thinking. So the table on the last slide is useful for that. If you have 79% equity, you won't know that exactly. Let's just say you think you've got between 75 and 80%, and the urgency is not that high because let's say you're out of position on the turn, or maybe your hand's just a bit lower, it's only 74% equity, you're in position on the turn. Either way, you don't have to bet, but you do have enough equity that you can bet. And if you do bet, your bet would be defined as a value bet, but you don't have to. And remember, if you bet every optional value bet, you're not gaining anything by betting. Don't have a prejudice towards getting value. Don't be biased towards it. If, in theory, the EV of checking and betting are the same, it just means that the EV of check comes from less obvious sources than the EV of betting does. So don't let yourself be blinded by betting and just feel like you have to because you can. One of the worst and most widespread thought processes in poker, and my students are always a bit shocked when I say this, is simply this thought process: I'm going to value bet here. Now you might be thinking, surely that's just a bread and butter poker thought process, Pete. Well, it is, but it has a very subtle danger of just ignoring that betting and checking are choices. And if you value bet just because you can, then all of your optional value bets basically become must value bets to you, and then your checking range is garbage. Look for this in your opponent's games. It's not common to find opponents who know how to slow play effectively in spots where GTO lets you slow play. There are spots where you can't, right? Those are must value bet spots. But out of position, your opponent still has a bet opportunity on the turn. You're on the flop still. Maybe you're on the river out of position with certain blockers. There's lots of times you can slow play a hand that you wouldn't think to. And then cannot value bet. When people try to value bet a hand, or try to bet a hand in general, that's around 58% equity on the turn or 63 on the river, they're typically making a blunder. They're typically betting a mediocre hand that has very high check EV, and due to the uselessness of that extra investment when they bet, too much of that extra investment just gets lost when they're losing for no reason, while not actually accruing any value when they're winning, and therefore just not making that investment would have been higher EV. Hope you guys understand that concept, right? That when you bet, you do risk extra, so that extra has to be working, it has to be doing something for you in order to actually be worth it. Poker's all about risk and reward, investment and gain and loss, these ratios. So the idea is that you're not building a betting range in a spot with like 4% pot or 17% pot, because there's no point. it doesn't do any better than checking, generally, in theory. So if the minimum bet size you would consider is, let's say, 75% pot in some spot, which is reasonable in position, where you don't want to reopen for small bets necessarily, and your hand only has 65% equity, then you are definitely in a cannot value bet spot, because while you win most of the time, you don't if you bet and get action, so too much of your bet gets burned. So yeah, we'll practice this throughout this lecture and throughout the course and throughout the school in general. This is such a core skill, just knowing which of these worlds you're in. Try and think this way. Next time you're in a session of poker, stop and ask yourself, is this must, can, or cannot, and actually explicitly ask the question. Only that way are you likely to shake off your old habits, which may just be as sloppy as I'm going to bet for value, and actually introduce the Carrot Poker School, an objective theoretical poker framework that we're teaching here, into your game. It's one thing to watch and enjoy a course and think I'm learning. It's another one to actually implement things. We'll talk more about that later, how to work on implementation as the course goes on. So let's start with an example here of a time that you cannot value bet. In this situation, button has opened pre-flop and big blind is called. The out of position player checks the flop. Button bets the flop here, and let's say button's hand is 7 of spades, 7 of diamonds. Big blind calls and then checks the turn, and it's button's decision point here. What's button going to do? Is this a cannot value bet spot? Well, yes, absolutely. Could you conjure up some reasons for betting here? You could, but they wouldn't be sufficient. They wouldn't be good. And we'll start by understanding what button's landing equity is here. If you want to take a guess and just see how good your feel for equity is, by all means have a think about it. How high do you think button's equity is with this hand before he's bet? Remember, he's bet the flop and been called. How high is his equity on this turn? Okay, let's unpause and assume you've done that. His equity is 55.96%. Let's round that up to 56%. So he's a slight favourite. What happens, do you think, in position when you reopen the action as a slight favourite? Well, when your bet gets matched, i.e. called or raised, you're in bad shape. You're no longer going to be anywhere near 50% equity. If this was our finishing equity, well, fine, probably just about. We can value bet and we can be satisfied that when called, we're doing okay. But even if we bet 33% pot here, which is not a sizing I would recommend using on the turn in position, again, it's just not worth reopening action for such a small investment. Out of position, you know, eat your heart out, use B33, but in position it's not so good. So even if we do bet really tiny here, just on purpose so that we can maybe bet sevens, it's still a blunder because the hand only has 46.82% equity after it gets called, even for this sizing. So even for B33, there's still a 10%-ish equity drop here between using a bet and not. So if you check, you're going to retain that 56% equity. You can see why checking is so good, right? So this is not an acceptable finishing equity for a value bet. Okay, you could maybe argue if I was out of position here, it's not so bad because checking is less good and I'm not throwing away such a superior line. But in position, check is just way too good here for us to accept making an investment with only 46.82% when called. If we were bluffing, this would be another story, more on that next time, but bluffing here would mean that we have to get significant fold equity from hands that are actually ahead of us, and that's not happening, so you can forget about bluffing here. This hand is nowhere near bad enough to bluff, it's not good enough to value bet, it is closer to a value bet than a bluff. Sometimes it's useful to see these as spectrum. You have value betting here, bluffing here. Where's your hand on the spectrum? Sevens is closer to value betting, but it's just not, it's still a check. So B33 even is a mistake, and the EV loss of B33 here in solver land, in the solver's mind, don't take this literally, the EV in reality will be different for some reason or another, but it's good to have a baseline. That's why we learn poker theory, so we have a baseline. It's a big fallacy that poker theory is useless unless your opponents are playing exactly like the solver. Of course they're not, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a great starting point. Better than nothing. And B75 actually costs 10.72% of the pot. So if you are going to make a mistake here and randomly bet this hand, at least bet it small, because the closer you get to checking, the better, but you should just check, right? B0, 0% pot, that's the sizing you want. So B75 is a huge blunder. You're losing 10% of the pot. Again, you might be thinking, Pete, 10% of the pot's not that much. It adds up massively quickly. Because this is such a common situation, and because the pot's already nearly like probably 10 big blinds, something like that, you're basically losing a big blind. Losing a big blind in a hand is the equivalent to doing something like calling 9-4 off to an under the gun open or something. It's like really bad, right? So you want to avoid that. So why do people make the mistake of betting here? Well, there are some reasons that are very common that you hear in general poker parlance all the time that you should actually just refute. If you catch yourself making some of these reasons, you have to say like 10 poker Hail Marys and all that sort of thing and cleanse yourself of these aberrations. But yeah, on a serious note, here's a bad thought process. I wanted to end the hand before the third heart came. You can't. If your opponent has a flush draw, they don't fold, right? To a normal sized turn bet here. They call you or raise you, and if they raise you, you lose because you fold generally with this hand. Maybe you call, but you call for like 0 EV. So this isn't a reason to bet. You don't just get to force your opponent to fold with a flush draw. It doesn't happen. Even if it did, it wouldn't be enough of his range to matter. I didn't want to lose initiative. This is just a desire-based thing. What the human is doing, and I say human because a solver would never do this, what a human is doing when he or she says I didn't want to lose initiative is basically saying I don't like the feeling of playing the river after checking back the turn here because my opponent bets and I don't like the feeling of facing bets. It makes me feel hunted, persecuted, bullied, under pressure, stressed. We don't like these things, so very often we try to avoid future mental states, right? If I know I need to phone my mother, I don't want to phone my mother, let's say. Hypothetically, of course I'd always want to phone my mother, right guys? And I do it because I think that if I don't, I'll feel guilty about it later. I'm being motivated by fear of a future mental state. That's what's happening here in poker. We don't want to lose initiative. We don't want to be on the receiving end of a bet because we don't like it. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it, objectively speaking, theoretically speaking. This is the same thing. I didn't want to face a river bet. Very similar thought process here. Or I wanted to rep a straight. This is a very misguided thought process. This is like jumping from 1 to 63 without counting the numbers in between, logically speaking. Repping a straight doesn't mean anything because when you make a bet, you don't control your opponent's thoughts when they face that bet. Just because you're thinking about a straight when you make a bet like this doesn't mean that your opponent now also telepathically is brainwashed into thinking that you have a straight. Unless you're playing live and you say, I've got the straight, bro, and then you bet. But that's a bit different. That's mind games and meta and leveling, and we'll ignore that. So when you rep a straight, all you're saying is a straight is one of my value bets. Villain knows that in theory, and he still calls lots of better hands than this, so this doesn't mean anything. This is just noise. I bet for protection. This is a horrible thought process because protection is not a sufficient reason for betting. We'll see that in a minute. I will go over this in detail. But you have to have a primary reason for betting, and this is not close enough to value and certainly not close enough to a bluff. I was targeting low pocket pairs, tunnel vision, blinkered vision, only thinking about one part of villain's range. Just because your opponent folds 5s and 4s and 3s here doesn't mean that they fold enough of their range on average. I might be sitting in the card room making this bet, thinking he's going to fold 4s, then he flips over 4s and folds, and that's actually a worse hand in this case, right? So it's even more ridiculous. Maybe I want him to call with 4s. So maybe I make this bet, villain calls with 4s, let's say, and then we win at showdown. And I'm like, I'm a genius. I'm an absolute legend. I put him on 4s. I was targeting 4s. He had 4s. He called with 4s. Surely I'm the greatest. I'm like Phil Hellmuth, I'm the greatest. But that's not actually true because you just tunneled in on one part of that player's range and got very lucky when he or she happened to have that hand. It doesn't make any sense as an objective thought process. So 7s is a hand that has to check. Green in the solver means check with the color coding that we've got going on here. You can see that the EV in percentage pot share EV, is lower slightly if we bet small. It's not a huge mistake to bet small, but you still shouldn't bother. And then betting big or over betting is a blunder for obvious reasons. Okay, example 2. These are spots where it's optional to value bet, meaning that you should actually mix theoretically speaking so that you're not always doing it and not always checking either. So again, same action sequence leading up to this point in the hand. We go for a B33 on the flop, standard stuff. We have king 10 this time. We could bet or check this hand on the flop. It's already optional because urgency is low. There's so much time left to come, right? As we said. In position on the turn, time remaining wise, urgency is higher because we're closer to showdown. We're closer to the last chance for betting, which is the river in position, the 6th node out of 6 if you like. But the problem is that our hand has just plummeted in equity. This has happened for 2 reasons. Firstly, we've been called by many hands that beat us, like stronger kings. Villain has folded his heir that gave us a lot of equity on the flop. He doesn't have that anymore. And then also the other part of this is that flushes now became possible. So any flush draw or 4-5 combo in our opponent's range has now moved ahead of us, as has pocket 3s. Although I think that can full flop. So again, we can begin by examining our landing equity, which is 67%. So it's true, when you have king 10 here, you have a very good hand on the turn. Winning 66% of the time, or 67 in poker is great. You know, this is a game where we take the thinnest of edges, where we celebrate getting it in with 58% pre-flop, right? So of course this is a lot of equity. That doesn't tell us what to do. Equity is not EV, it doesn't just tell you that you want to bet. If we could have this much of the pot in EV after betting and getting called, it'd be a no-brainer, right? We definitely want to bet. But on a dry turn or river, this is not enough equity for b75. This is actually just a check. Because remember, on a dry turn or river, if your opponent ever has any equity, then that equity will always come from beating you. Usually, because there aren't many draws that he can have to be slightly behind. Here it's not so bad because our equity is a bit better than it looks here. The reason the solver says we've only got 67% isn't that we're losing 33-34% of the time here. It's actually that a lot of the time when we're winning and could value bet if we could see our opponent's hand, we're not as far ahead as we would be on a dry board, and that brings down our overall equity. So this is still in the realms of can value bet because it's such a wet texture. If this was like King 7-7 deuce rainbow, you don't want to really be betting with 66% equity on the turn in position. You don't want to be reopening the action with that level of equity. But villain having plenty of hands that are pair plus draw, pair plus straight draw, and diamond, diamond draw, gutter and diamond draw, ace high with diamond draw with live pair draw, that sort of thing. He's gonna have hands within this 20 to 30% equity band pretty frequently. And what that means is our equity is actually better than it looks. Thus, this hand qualifies for a b75 value bet as an optional play. There is no urgency to do this here. Just like with your homework task, if it's due in a week and you have only, let's say, 500 words to write, you could do it now. It's optional. There's no problem with doing it now, but you could definitely wait a while as well and then do it. You could do it tomorrow or the next day, or if you want to be like me when I was in school, just do it the night before, right? That's what we all really did, let's face it. So this spot's not very urgent. We don't have to see this value bet as anything that we have to do. Our hand does not need to bet here because it's not seeking to win a massive amount of money or build a huge pot. If we had the nut flush here with a straight flush draw, you have to bet. Ace-5 of diamonds got to bet because that hand is almost always seeking a very high investment ceiling and needs to get cracking. This hand does not. So if we look at the solver's verdict to the bottom right here, a bettable hand with low urgency is a mix. And the reason you shouldn't just always bet, you might prefer betting. You might be like, I don't like checking because like the fourth diamond might come. You might have some imaginary reason why you think betting is better. It's not objectively. You need to read. You need to say villain is playing in such a way that game theory isn't that makes it better. If you can't do that, you should mix, and the reason you should mix is that you don't want to build a stupidly weak checking range for no gain. I mean, being unbalanced is not as bad as people think because we're not playing against omniscient opponents who hunt us down necessarily. This will depend on what we call the visibility of your game, right? How many hands you're going to be playing with the same people and whether they have HUDs and whether they're observant, lots of things like that. But usually speaking, it's not good to be unbalanced for absolutely no gain. Be unbalanced when you're exploiting somebody, but there's no point in just always playing in a really predictable way, especially when that predictable way is the same way that good regs expect other players to play in. When a lion hunts a pack of antelope, it doesn't target one exact antelope, it just targets the behavior of an antelope per se. And if you are an antelope, you will behave like the pack and you will be eaten. It's just the way it goes. So don't have the same leak that the rest of the pool has. It's like being in a herd of antelope and getting eaten by a tiger, i.e. a good player. So some pros and cons of betting then to let you understand why the EV is equal here of bet and check and why this is an optional bet only. Well, firstly, betting denies equity to some live hands. This is good. If your opponent has 8s here and folds and the river would have been a set making card, that's a win. A very minor win that presides over a very small part of the game tree, but a win nonetheless. Maybe a more major win is villain folding ace-4, folding an overcard to our pair and a gut shot. Okay, ace-4 of spades, he throws it in the muck. Good stuff. Maybe he folds ace-9. Okay, that's useful. Cool. But if he folds a hand like, I don't know, 3-5 or 4s with a diamond, that would be amazing, right? But he's not really meant to fold 4s with a diamond. He's not meant to fold the ace of diamonds, so you can forget about getting him to fold really high equity draws. Another pro of betting is getting value from king 9, king 8. Before some action killing river comes, you bet, he calls king 9, a diamond comes, check, check. You've won an extra bet you wouldn't have won had you checked turn. That's tunnel vision though. We're only isolating one pro of betting here. Don't make that the whole game tree. I've heard people do this. Why did you bet? I wanted to get value from a weaker king before a diamond came. That's so specific. Why have you isolated that one part of the game tree? Because you're not zoomed out enough. You're not seeing the bigger picture enough. That's why. Betting, on the other hand, loses extra money versus better top pair. If you don't bet here versus king queen, and then another diamond comes, you get away for free. No one ever thinks of that, right? People reject checking as an option. They just close their eyes to it sometimes. Also, you could fold out a hand like ace-9 that will bluff river if you check. So On the one hand, you might think it's good to fold out the bottom of villain's range to stop it like binking a 3-outer on you, but actually, if those hands are meant to bet river in Equilibrium, which they probably are, more on that next time, then you definitely want to consider getting EV by actually checking here as well and inducing those bluffs. So the pros of check is that it keeps the pot smaller when villain has a better hand, i.e. loses less money. Lets villain bluff the bottom of his range on the river. You won't get paid by those hands by betting turn. On the flip side, unfortunately, checking lets some hands get there that would have folded to a bet. Don't over-prioritize that part of the tree. I know it's tempting to. We're very inclined to protect our own resources as humans, right? We want to keep what's ours. How offended are you if you don't get given a television today? Not very. How offended are you if someone comes and burgles you and takes your television? Very. The net gain or loss is still 1 TV, but it's very different when it's being taken from your own possession, right? So this is why we over-prioritize betting for denial or protection, because we really want to keep what's ours. But that's biased in poker. Poker doesn't really care whether the TV is yours or someone else's. It's just 1 TV. And so yeah, getting value from hands like weaker King X before action killing rivers come, yeah, you don't get to do that if you check. But again, it's not a big part of the game tree. So this is more complex than you might think. This tussle between bet and check that the solver goes through here, it's weighing up all of these things, right? It's battling against itself. It's coming to the conclusion that if its opponent plays well, there's no reason why this hand should be winning money as a bet compared to a check or vice versa. A hand like pocket eights, you have to check though, right? This won't be the same for any hand. Not every hand is optional, of course. On that note, there are some hands that you actually have to value bet because they're just too good and the urgency is too high. Generally speaking, when you're on the turn in position, your urgency is pretty high. There's not that much time remaining in the hand. If you check, you'll go to the river. Okay, you'll have one more bet opportunity, maybe a raise opportunity if the opponent bets. But in general, your urgency is much higher than it would be on the flop or would be on the turn out of position, where your opponent still has a betting opportunity if you check. So here with ace deuce, there is no such thing as checking. There's not a thing to slow play this hand in Equilibrium. It would be a big mistake. And our landing equity here is extremely high. As this board is a lot drier than ones we've looked at previously, you can see that the very good hands actually have more equity. They almost look better than they are, perhaps, in terms of equity. Or they look as good as they are, rather than the equity making them look worse than they are. So, while there are some heart draws here that call, there aren't as many pair plus draw hands calling as in the last situation. There aren't as many combo draw type hands. So yeah, it's a bit more way ahead, way behind, right? And with the exception of some flush draws, we'll just need to be a bit more strict about how much equity we need to value bet, because for most of villain's hands that beat us, we don't want to value bet against those. And while we can value bet against the flush draw, they're not a big part of his range. So most of that 94% equity is just from us winning like every single time. It's from having the immortal nuts and just doing amazingly. There aren't many draws to bring that down, right? Like there were in the previous hands. So this is a huge equity hand. And urgency is high-ish because we're in position and we crave not just 3 streets of value, but we want to talk about how big a pot we want to win. Betting 20% of the pot 3 times with this hand would not cut it. That would be a big mistake in Equilibrium. So it's not just that, it's that we actually want to win large pots. Our investment ceiling is very high, so we get going immediately. The solver chooses overbet here. Very interesting, this output, right? So check is losing about 10% of the pot here, and this hand just has to be 150. That's the purple color, 150% pot. Classic overbet size. And it's interesting, isn't it, that in EV terms, you get 196.41% pot by overbetting. Then it goes down quite considerably by 3% if you B75. Then it goes up again if you B33. What the hell is going on? Any ideas? Well, what's happening here is that when you B33, you actually get raised at a much higher frequency than if you B75. So you claw back some of that EV. Don't count on humans to do that. One of the least raised spots, generally speaking, is people attacking small bets. You might think it should happen a lot, right? He bets small, I attack. No, humans don't do this as much as solvers do. They don't value raise aggressively enough. They call too much with thin value hands instead of raising, that's to say, and they don't bluff enough either, generally. So avoid B33 here. Don't build it into your strategy. It shouldn't be a thing in your toolkit here. Just overbet. This spot is a classic overbet node. And you can still have very good finishing equity. Look how little that's gone down. Again, that's because you're almost always just annihilating villain in this situation. So even after you make a huge investment and he gets rid of the worst hands in his range, and then some, he folds a lot to this size, right? About 60% of range to be precise. You're still killing him. The reason it goes down is that hands like flush draws that are the more live things in his range against your hand go up in prevalence. If there are hands that villain is never folding to your overbet here, it's stuff like ace-8 of hearts that has a draw and showdown value. That hand isn't just calling to chase a flush draw. He doesn't know you have this hand, he beats your bluffs, remember. King-Queen of hearts, same thing, he beats your bluffs a lot of the time. So, because villain's range filters a bit more towards these things when he calls, that's why your equity goes down slightly, but because you basically have the immortal nuts here, your equity cannot go down that much. So what do you think is wrong with the following arguments against overbetting? Because, I've taught a lot of poker, and students of this level often, they feel a resistance to overbetting. They don't want to do it. So what do you think's wrong with their reasoning? Villain will fold a lot. I don't want to overbet because he'll fold a lot. Well, the objection to this is simply that he's supposed to fold a lot. You're meant to get more fold equity when you bet bigger, but value betting isn't about getting called. That's right. Value betting is about how much you win on average. So it's often perfectly acceptable to make more money when called and also increase your fold equity when value betting. If the goal was just to get called, you would bet one big blind, right? That's a terrible thing to do. That's like checking. That's a big mistake. We wouldn't play a bluff this way. Actually, you just would play a bluff this way. You're supposed to play bluffs this way. This is just your problem, right? Not theory's problem. I love to say to people, that's not theory's problem. Like when they object to like some game theory concept, it's like, that's just something that you're doing for no reason. So if you don't want to bluff with the sizing, fix it. It's a mental game leak. It's a resistance. And then thirdly, we make it obvious that our hand is strong. No, you don't. You make it obvious that your hand is not Jack-7, or 5-4, or pocket sevens, or ace-queen. You don't make it obvious that you don't have a bluff. Your hand could be ace-3, it could be 5-3, it could be a flush draw, it could be king-queen, it could be any of these bluffs. So your range is always disguised as long as you have a very polarized B150 range that uses value bets and then bluffs. Just, you don't have medium stuff, but you don't need to leave everything to be a possibility within your range. There's no reason why your opponent needs to think that you could have a medium strength hand here. That would be silly. Okay, let's move on and talk a little bit about denial. So denying equity to live hands that your opponent has to fold is a useful bonus, but it's not a sufficient reason for betting in and of itself. Denial comes in handy when fold equity is largely useful to you. So that means if villain is largely folding hands that are totally dead, then why is that good for me? Denial is only a useful thing if he's folding 15, 20, 25% equity hands on a regular basis, not 5% equity hands. If you flipped your cards over and you didn't know I could see them, and you had 5% equity, I would rather check. If I wanted, the good thing to do would be to tell you you'd flipped your cards over, but if I wanted to exploit you and cheat you, angle shoot you, then I would just check my really good hand because I know you're folding your hand if I bet, right? And I want to try and get money. I'm definitely okay with you getting a 5% chance to hit the river if you're going to bluff 50% of the time when you miss. I get that money back that the 5% of the time you hit costs me, right? So let's compare two examples where we have a similar strength of hand. In one spot, the value bet is going to deny a lot of equity. Remember, it's a value bet because value betting is the primary purpose, but it will have a secondary purpose of denying equity, i.e. getting protection. And in the second case, the fold equity is more useless as villain's folding range is practically dead against our hand. So this is case one, where when we bet the turn as button for 75% pot, having bet flop, this is certainly a value bet. We are going to have starting equity here that's very high. I would guess it's going to be in the 80s comfortably, and is going to be fine for B75. The reason it's not higher is he can have overcards, gut shots, and sometimes a 5. He'll rarely have a hand that beats us here, but it is possible. Some 5x theoretically does slow play the flop. Trips doesn't raise flops as much as sets do. It's just a slightly weaker hand with worse blockers for getting called. So yeah, 9s here is a value bet with a bonus of denial. When we bet here, the reason we're allowed to do it, or the reason why we have to do it, is that we have a lot of equity when called, and something that sweetens the spot for us and is the cherry on top of betting is the useful fold equity we get from things like King Jack of Spades that called flop, and full turn. Or King Jack offsuit, I guess. Might be 3-betting King Jack of Spades here pre. So, very important to see denial as an added bonus. In this hand, there really isn't as much denial. Flush draws don't really fold here. You could lump them in as something we get value from. If villain has ace-8 of spades, he's likely to call our bet. We get value from that hand. We're a big favourite against that hand. But that's not denial. The things we deny equity to here are stuff like Jack-9. That's got 4 outs, not 6. It's not 2 overcards. It's not that strong. Maybe a pocket pair like pocket 3s, pocket 7s. That hand has 2 outs. Or maybe a pair on the board such as 6-4 suited. Again, that hand is very dominated by our specific holding. So for most of the hands that villain folds to our bet here, it's not so useful that he's folded. There's less to protect, but I don't really like the word protect. The reason I don't like to say protection here, and I've changed it to denial, is that protection makes it sound like it's something you have to do. I had to bet for protection. We need protection here. I need to protect my TV from that burglar. It comes with this necessity connotation. The thing with denial is I get to deny you something. It's more optional. It's more of a bonus. I think it's semantically cleaner. I'm a bit of a nitpicker when it comes to these things. I like things to be very tidy. Semantically speaking, I like the right words to be used for poker. I'm quite an academic about it. But I think it's important because when you use a word in poker, you don't just use it within poker. That word forms certain neural connections with other parts of your mind, right? So when you say protection, it does conjure these ideas of necessity. And it might have you bet for an insufficient reason. You might not have a value bet here. If you had pocket 8s here on the right hand side, it would not be a good turn bet, but you might make it if you're focused only on protection. So when we say I bet for protection here, we're typically hyper focused on the money that's already in the pot and already belongs to us based on the number of times that our hand is best or we make villain fold. Like if we have 80% equity and we get to make him fold, we then have 100%, but we're not thinking about gaining that 20%. We're actually just thinking about keeping our 80%. But usually you keep it by checking, that's the thing. If villain was just always going to hit the river, and I know it feels like that sometimes, guys, when you play poker, you always get run out on. You don't. Your brain prioritizes and remembers the things that sting. This is how we work as a species, survival orientation. So don't let your brain delude you into thinking that the 80% of the pot that you have is in some way more important than 80% of a pot that you didn't have. 80% is 80%. This is blinkered vision. This is over prioritizing the resources that you think are already yours or you're entitled to. How you should really think about the spot is that you should say, no, I'm not betting for protection or denial. I'm betting for value with a bonus of denial, or in rarer cases, you can even be betting mainly as a bluff with a bonus of denial. That's to say you're betting a hand against which villain folds a lot of better hands, but he or she also folds some worse hands that have outs as well. So the fold equity comes from different factions of your opponent's range, but they're both useful. But of course, getting someone to fold hands that have 70 or 80% equity against you is much more meaningful for the gain of betting than making someone fold 15 or 20%. So this is more holistic vision. So denying equity to hands that are already losing only wins you a little bit of the pot. But we're not thinking about that when we say I need to bet for protection. We're thinking about the whole pot and keeping our 80%, but we usually keep it anyway. That's the caveat. And when you risk the bet, you might say, well, what's the downside? Why can't I just secure that whole pot? Why can't I stop him hitting the river? Like, why not? Well, when you actually zoom out and look at a bird's eye view of the whole situation, that bet that you're making is actually a bet that you lose when you run into the hands that beat you and continue against you. When you make a really thin value, like too thin a value bet, because you want protection and you get raised, you just lose the pot and you lose that extra bet as well. So not only do you lose the whole pot anyway, but you maybe even lose it against a worse hand. There's times you bet a medium strength hand and villain raises you with a bad hand and you lose, but if you checked, you would have just called a river bet and won. There's so many times when things slip beneath the radar that are equally important to your EV. So yeah, this is not a thing. Betting for protection is not a thing. Get rid of this from your game if it exists. Start calling it denial, in my opinion, it's better, and then start adding it as a bonus at the end. So draw obsession syndrome, this is not unlinked to what we were just talking about. So let's go back to the flop for a second here. It's not at all uncommon for players at or below the sort of level where they're studying grade 1. I don't mean to imply that if you're watching this, you're a really weak player or you're studying grade 1. You might just be taking our school from the beginning, and that's totally sensible even if you're a stronger player. But players who are sort of at the level where grade 1 is difficult for them, they might be placing too much emphasis on the branch of the tree where villain has a draw, or that draw gets there later, resulting in hero losing a sizable pot. There's a double whammy going on here, impression-wise in the human mind, when we make a bet, get called by a draw, check back the turn, then the draw gets there, then he bets the river and we call and we lose. One, we have the sting of losing a big pot. Ouch, that hurts. I'll remember that. I need to avoid that in future. You can't. This is where your evolutionary patterns play tricks on you. And then secondly, the visual effect of seeing the 5 hearts across his hand in the board. He got there with a flush, you knew that hand was behind you before now it got there. There's a real temptation to think he's done something he shouldn't be able to do. He's got away with something. He's done a number on me. He's not. This is normal. Like, you're supposed to lose sometimes to draws that get there, and you're meant to give people free cards a lot of the time. It's also absurd to try and price draws out because they call anyway based on implied odds and showdown value in pair routes. They're not just draws, right? And also they can raise you, and also they have implied odds to call with and win bigger pots from you. I think I said that, but yeah, there's so many reasons why pricing a draw out is really silly. It's not even all of villain's range, it's far from it. It's a very small part of villain's range normally. So what if in pricing out a draw you just make a bet that gets you crushed against all the better hands? What about that? So you got to zoom out. What do you think of this spot? Again, single raise pot, big blind checks the flop to us and we're button. And our hand is aces. What does your instinct say? Do you have a gut reaction? Was it to bet or was it to check? Think about it a bit more now. Pause the video for 30 seconds. Have a think. Okay, I'll assume you've done that. Did you reconsider anything there? Did you do a bit more comparing maybe? As we say in the school a lot, poker choices are comparisons, right? Bet and check are actually, they both need your attention in a spot like this. You can't reject bet without looking at check and vice versa. Oftentimes people will just say, oh, don't like checking, he might get there, I bet. Terrible thought process. Solver checks all the time here, though admittedly the EVs are extremely close of betting and checking. There's not a lot going on. Why is this close? Like, why do you not have to bet here? Because it might seem at first sight like you do when you first start playing the game. Well, firstly, the urgency with this hand is not high because it's not a strong value hand at all. It's actually just a mediocre to good hand. It can value bet, so if you bet here, it is for value, and you will be enough of a favourite to put you in a sort of optional value bet spot here. I know the solver's always checking, but the EV is super close, right? So I wouldn't read too much into that. But yeah, the problem is that it's by no means mandatory because there are other ways you can make money as well. You can check back and you can get villain to bluff later. You can delay your value bet and bet later on clean turns. There's lots of other stuff you can do. So here's a thought experiment. If we have aces and he has a hand like queen 10, right? It's one of these sort of, he has a high equity draw. We need to stop him getting the odds. We need to like price him out. We need to make him fold. Well, firstly, you can't price this hand out without like going all in. You have to like literally go all in to stop this hand calling against two aces. And it's irrelevant anyway because it's too small a part of his range you're thinking about. So this hand will call you or raise you, whatever you do. And it's not even intrinsically any better to bet against this hand than it is to check because this hand is so close to flipping with you anyway that your EV will never be that high, even against this hand if you bet and he calls. In fact, his EV will be higher than yours because he has implied odds and you don't. He has like ways of making really strong hands and earning future bets, whereas you're not likely to make many future bets against queen 10 unless you get like a dream turn. So many turns here are going to cause you to check, and therefore this hand has a lot of realizability here. So urgency can't be that high when villain has this hand, because you don't have enough equity against this hand to make urgency high, even in this toy game where you only have aces and he only has queen 10. Of course, in reality, you can have other hands and so can your opponent, but even in this toy game where you have this hand and he has that hand, it's still not that great to bet. Of course, no reasonable draw would ever fold to a bet. Your opponent would have to be an extremely bad poker player to fold a flush draw to one bet on the flop, as we know. So denial is not a thing. People know this, but they still slip up here. They still imagine that for some reason they might get their opponent off of some kind of really good hand. That's not happening. So there's nothing to gain by betting aces, even when villain has this specific type of hand. That's the point. So if there's nothing to gain against this specific type of hand, it becomes quite clear that if villain has queen jack of diamonds, there's really nothing to gain by betting, right? The hands that fold this flop are actually tragically far behind us from villain's point of view. So why not let them hit a jack or a queen? Why not value bet later against them? Why not let them bluff later? The only hand that it's actually useful to bet against here from a denial standpoint would be something like a raw gutter, maybe like king 10, and maybe if you bet big enough it folds, but then you've just lost too much against other parts of his range. You're actually losing here a fair amount of the time. Your hand's only going to be like a 70% equity holding, something like that. So it's not urgent that you bet here. So to finish up here, how should we view denial? I think we can view it as a swing factor. That's to say that denial can have the impact of swinging a thin value hand, which would normally prefer to check in a way ahead, way behind situation, to being a bet on a wetter texture, or maybe a texture where it's lower, it's more dynamic, villain has more overcards that he's folding, gutter plus pair that he's folding, that kind of thing. So let's return to this previous flop and imagine that the action went as follows. We bet the flop, third pot. I think this is a good sizing on a board where villain has a lot of nutty hands. Much better to big bet on boards where villain is more capped. And with this hand, we bet and get called. You can actually make a very weird bet here on an extremely favourable turn. Like I said, if we knew the turn was going to be the deuce of hearts, we could bet the aces, right? Because it's a much, much better situation for our range when villain misses all of his flush draws. And straight draws and combo draws and pair plus draw, if we knew the turn was the two of hearts, would actually be really low EV on the flop and we could value bet against them much more happily. So when this card comes on the turn, it follows that you can actually get quite cocky for value here because your pair of sevens is much better than it would be on most turns. It's fairly close to a value bet. In fact, you might look at this and think, but it's only got 43% equity. That's its finishing equity, right? That's not high enough. We said that it needs to be about 50%. But the thing is, that this is such a wet texture that actually your hand is winning way more often than this. Remember we spoke before about how on really wet textures your equity is better than it looks. So the real power of your hand here is greater than 43% because, not all of it, but a lot of villain's equity against you comes from being behind you and just having outs. So this hand can actually bet on such a dream turn. It feeds into this idea that wet textures require less equity for betting. So the way you should think about denial as a swing factor here is that denial is swinging this hand from being slightly too thin to value bet to being actually good enough to value bet. Value is still the primary reason for the bet, but it needs that bonus from denial in order to become a good bet. Otherwise it's going to be a mistake. So villain folding hands like these definitely helps in that endeavor. I'll now introduce the homework task and then allow for you to pause the video to complete the task. I'll then go over the answers. So again, a turn barrel spot. This is our bread and butter for today. Button against big blind checks. Button's going to bet the flop here. Big blind's going to call. And we have a turn barrel situation. Label the following hands in this spot as cannot value bet, i.e. too weak, not got the requisite equity. Optional value bet, meaning has enough equity to value bet, but will not be needing to do it, will not be in an urgent enough situation that it's so important that we do it. And then thirdly, must value bet. Where are the situations where if we don't put money into the pot, we're actually going to be losing EV? Imagine for this exercise that you have the choice between checking and betting something like 75% of the pot. We said before that these really small bets aren't going to feature, so ignore them. Let's imagine 75% is your sizing in this spot. Okay, I'll let you have an attempt at this just now. Alright, hope you enjoyed performing that homework task, and I'm now going to go over the answers. Sixes and king queen, hands 1 and 2, are mandatory value bets. They have too much equity at this level of urgency to check, they just have to rush pot growth. Their investment ceiling is very high. King 4 does not have to bet because villain is still supposed to slow play some king x theoretically on the flop here, and thus this hand is going to be a bit less far ahead than sixes or king queen. It will bet the river if it doesn't bet turn, but this hand is happy to lay down the gauntlet here and say, okay, I could value bet the turn sometimes, or alternatively, I can check, let you invest on the river with the very bottom of your range as a bluff, and then value bet against your medium stuff there again anyway. The idea is that you're not getting 3 streets at a super high frequency against villain's medium strength hands here. You do sometimes, but not so often are you crushing after betting 3 streets here that you have to bet king 4. Contrast that to sixes or king queen, which are much stronger. Pocket jacks, pocket nines and pocket sevens are all optional. These hands gain value. They are value bets. They have enough equity because this board is so hard to hit, and because villain will be raising king x on the flop at a fair frequency. These hands are doing well enough that they can definitely value bet. Ace 6 is similar, it can also value bet. Deuces is a very strange hand. It's basically right on the cusp. Because this situation is so dry and it's so difficult for villain to connect and interact with this board, you might see your solvers recommend some betting with deuces here. Deuces is also the most vulnerable pair imaginable, so whenever villain has an unpaired hand, they will necessarily have 2 overcards to deuces. So deuces has a lot of denial here, but because villain has to call some flush draws and some ace high here, this hand can actually be seen as a value bet for b75. Ace queen is a bit worse than deuces in the sense that it's lower down. It's better in the sense that it has more outs when behind. This hand is also not terrible to value bet with. It shouldn't be a big EV loss to bet this hand in your solver. Villain will call plenty of worse hands. Your equity when called will be close-ish to 50%. You'll have the ace and the queen as outs that can help you win a big pot later, and you can also get folds from hands like jack 10 that are live against you. So ace queen is not a terrible value denial bet hybrid either, and ace 10 is the only hand here that you must check. This hand is mediocre. Note that I didn't include any bluff candidate hands here, there are no hands in this batch that are low enough EV that you should really even have considered bluffing. You'd have to be down at like bad queen high jack high before that's the case here. Okay, hope you enjoyed lecture 2, and I'll see you all back here again for lecture 3, where we'll talk about bluffing. Bye for now, guys.